Chapter 11, Real Estate Contracts. This is what it's all about, folks. I've got to tell you, this is our bread and butter. Let's talk about what a contract is. A contract is a mutual meeting of the minds. In other words, it's something that all parties know what they've agreed to. The parties in a contract should be, now they don't have to be, but they should be competent. And when I say competent, they need to be at least 18 years or older, and they need to be mentally competent. In terms of what contracts we as a licensee can prepare, we can prepare sale and purchase agreements, we can prepare listing agreements, and we can prepare option contracts. Now, let's talk about what a conveyance instrument is. A conveyance instrument is a legal document that we're supposed to stay away from. Only lawyers can do those. A deed is a conveyance instrument. A mortgage is a conveyance instrument, and they require the OR, the grantor, the mortgagor, requires their signature with 2 witnesses. They're a conveyance. A lease is also a conveyance instrument, but Florida law allows licensees to prepare leases provided they do not go more than 1 year. Florida statute of frauds says that certain contracts have to be in writing to be enforceable. The real estate sales agreement has to be in writing. Option contracts have to be in writing. In fact, options contracts have to be in writing just to exist. Leases for more than a year have to be in writing to be enforceable. And certain listing contracts, the exclusive right of sale listing contract and the exclusive brokerage contract, have to be in writing to be enforceable. Now, there are other situations where contracts can be enforceable that are not in writing. We call that a partial performance doctrine. Maybe an oral agreement where you took a deposit from somebody, but the deposit alone is not sufficient. Maybe you let them move in or you let them start repairs. That might be enforceable. Statute of limitations says that if you breach a contract, there's a 5-year statute of limitation for lawsuits. And it also has to do with fraud as well. The difference between something that's void and voidable. A contract that's void doesn't exist. A contract that's voidable exists but could become void. And let me give you a good example. If you enter into a contract with a minor, you can enter into a contract with a minor, but remember, it's a one-way street. They can enforce it against you, but you cannot enforce it against them. So as long as a minor doesn't want to back out, you can go forward. In other words, it's voidable on their part. If you take a listing and you're unlicensed or your license is expired, that listing is void. That contract is void. So it's either void or voidable. The essentials of a contract on page 11-4. Remember we said that a person needs to be at least 18 years or older and mentally competent? Well, not totally, but that's what we would like to move forward with an enforceable agreement. We have to have a meeting of the minds. That simply means that all the parties know what all the parties have agreed to. But remember that in order for a contract to be enforceable, it needs to be in writing and signed by the parties involved. To create a contract, we have to have an offer, we have to have an acceptance of that offer, and then in order to create the contract, we must have a communication back to create that meeting of the minds. There needs to be legal object there. In other words, you need to be contracting for something that's legal. There also needs to be consideration. We like to think that money is it, but it doesn't have to be. Listen very closely. In a sale and purchase agreement, the pure fact that the buyer promised to buy and the seller promised to sell is sufficient to make it legal and enforceable. There are several categories to contracts. The bilateral contract. Remember, what is a bicycle? Bicycle has 2 wheels. A bilateral contract means that both parties have promised to do something. A sale and purchase agreement. Buyer promised to buy, seller promised to sell. In a unilateral contract, only one person promises. Like an option contract. The seller promises to sell, but that buyer does not promise. They simply say, I've got to look-see and I may or may not purchase, but I'm going to give you definite valuable consideration since I've not put anything else up for consideration. Contract negotiations, we have the offer or and the offeree. Always remember, ORs give, EEs receive. So the offeror gives the offeree receives it. Now, if the offeree doesn't like it, changes it, and submits a counter, that offeree then becomes the offeror. Regarding the offer and acceptance, what I want you to also understand that at any time before that communication back has been made, either party can withdraw, because up to that point it's non-contractual. One more time, offer acceptance is not sufficient. It requires that communication back to complete it, to make it enforceable. Either party can withdraw at any time before that communication has been made. I want to talk to you now about termination of offers. There are a number of ways that we can terminate offers: acceptance, withdrawal, rejection, counter offers, lapse of time. There's a number of ways that we can terminate offers. But remember this, an offer is non-contractual. It's non-contractual. It doesn't become a contract until that offer's been accepted and communicated back. Now the question is, how do you terminate contracts? That's the real issue. Performance, mutual rescission, destruction of the property. But let me tell you what the big one is. The big one is breach. One of the parties or both the parties have decided they don't want to go through with the deal. There's several remedies. One is liquidated damages, but let me say this: liquidated damages can only be afforded to the seller if the buyer breaches. That deposit already belongs to the buyer. So liquidated damages is only afforded to the seller. Both parties can also sue for specific performance. They can sue for liquidated damages. They can sue for rescission. And they can also just simply go to court and sue. So there's a lot of remedies. Just remember also that contracts can be assigned once they become a contract. I think that the important issue here is that just because you assign your contract does not mean that you're off the hook. Unless the other party that you've contracted with gives you novation. Remember, novation is a release of liability. You're still on the hook. Important real estate contracts. Let's talk about listing contracts. There are 3 listing contracts that we deal with on a regular basis. The open listing simply says, Mr. Broker or broker, I'm going to list my property with you, but I reserve the right to list it with other brokers, and I'll also reserve the right to sell it myself without owing you a commission. Well, I got to tell you, there's too many variables there. Most brokers don't fool with that. Another type of listing is the exclusive brokerage. And that's where the seller says, broker, I'm going to list it with you exclusively, no other brokers. But I still reserve the right to sell it myself without owing you a commission. A little bit better, but still, that's not what we're looking for. The best listing for us is going to be the exclusive right of sale listing contract. Broker, I'm going to list it with you and no other brokers. And no matter who sells it during the listing period, you're going to be paid. Now, be careful about that net listing. The net listing is a listing where we promise the seller a net amount at closing. Here is the catch. We can never receive more than a normal commission would be on our side. In other words, we can't gouge our customer or client in a net listing. The sale and purchase agreement, let me tell you what that's about. When a buyer and seller enters into a sale and purchase agreement, the seller still has legal title to the property until it closes. But the buyer has what we call equitable title. In other words, they have an interest in that real property. Some of the required disclosures that we have: radon gas, which is an odorless, colorless gas. Buyers can have their home inspected prior to closing for radon. They can have it inspected for lead-based paint if in fact the property or the home was built prior to 1978. Energy efficiency, there's a homeowners association disclosure if there is one. Flood insurance. Let me make a comment about stigmatized properties. A stigmatized property is where a homicide or suicide has occurred, nothing else. This is a non-disclosable issue for licensees. But I think what a lot of people have to do is put their moral compass on and let that moral compass direct you. How do you want to handle it? If your customer says don't disclose it, that's a lawful order. You've got to make up your mind how you want to handle that. Remember what an option contract is. An option contract is a unilateral contract where the seller promises to sell, the buyer does not promise to buy, but in order to make it contractual, they've got to give some kind of consideration. Typically, they put up money that's non-refundable. An option contract must be in writing, period, to even exist. The optionor is the giver of the option. The optionee is the receiver. Installment sale contract is like a contract for deed. And what you're basically doing is, an installment sale is where you're making payments. It's seller financing. But typically what happens is a deed is not given up. You simply make payments, and at a certain point then a deed is given. It's called a contract for deed. And finally, I want you to remember about the disclosures, 1985 Johnson versus Davis. Remember, caveat emptor was altered. Today, if a seller knows of a latent material defect in a residential transaction, they must disclose that to a potential buyer prior to entering into a contract to purchase. And that's all I've got for Chapter 11 and the real estate contracts. Go back. I really want you to look at this one. This is your bread and butter. This is what makes us money. And right now what I'd like to do is I'd like to review that chapter with you. Chapter 11, review of real estate contracts. The statute of fraud requires certain contracts to be in writing to be enforceable. The statute of limitation allows action to be taken within 5 years of a breach of a contract. The partial performance doctrine allows an oral real estate contract to be enforceable provided that part of the purchase price was given and that the buyer is either allowed to move in or start renovations or other repairs. Contracting parties should be 18 years or older and mentally competent. They don't necessarily have to be. Contracts with a minor are voidable. It's legal, but it's not enforceable on their part. There has to be an offer, an acceptance of that offer, and then a communication back in order to create a contract. A breach of contract can be remedied in a number of ways. Liquidated damages can only be afforded to the seller. They can also collect specific performance or unliquidated damages. Listing contracts include open listings, exclusive listings, and exclusive right of sale contracts. The one that brokers are looking for is the exclusive right of sale. It's the best. And remember that with a net listing, you can't gouge your seller. You can never collect more than a normal commission would be afforded. The sale and purchase agreement, the seller has legal title up until closing, and the buyer has what we call equitable title. The required disclosures, rate on gas, lead-based paint for those homes built prior to '78. Of course, there are a lot more than that, but those are your majors. Option contracts are unilateral. And that's all I have for Chapter 11's contract review.